Okay, well, we are talking about our upcoming Moses series, and so we're going to spend 4 weeks looking at kind of the first part of Moses's journey as it's described in Exodus. And so we're going to quickly preview each of the four sermons in this series, kind of talk about them big picture, and then just kind of make sure all these work together, they're complementary, and they kind of hit on different issues. So we're going to go in order, which seems appropriate. So we'll start first off with Dave. So Dave, if you want to just kind of tell us where you're at from our previous discussions with week one of the Moses series.
Okay, well, my topic is more when God begins your story. And I thought I'd begin with just giving just a little bit of historical background and context, just about how the Egyptians had made, the Hebrew slaves. They were in bondage, and then the new Pharaoh actually got very ruthless, almost Nazi-like in his treatment of the Jews. And in that kind of context, Moses is born, and his life is threatened the day he's born. And really, I kind of ended up with kind of five ideas. One was God was working before they knew it. Kind of stole that one from Brian, so I thought he would shake his head like, oh, good. But I do think it's
It's the smartest thing I ever heard you say.
but I do think it's a really good point because God was at work. And then move from there to see that God sees and he cares, and that motivates him to take action. Because they cry out to God, and in Exodus 3:7 he says, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. So God does see and he does care, and he's not taken unawares by our suffering and our plight. He loves us and cares about us, and that motivates him to action on our behalf for his glory. And then the third movement would be that God's plans are unstoppable, that Pharaoh really thought that he could, prevent God's people from growing and becoming the people of God, and, really went to great lengths by trying to kill the males to prevent God's plan, but his plans are unstoppable. And then really in all of these, I'm just going to talk in your life. Are you in a crisis that's overwhelming, a situation that you feel undone about, that you don't know if the trial is going to end, you don't have the resources, and to just take heart that God really sees, he cares, and the plans that he has for you, Jeremiah 29:11, he is going to fulfill those plans. And they're good plans for his glory and for your benefit. And then the fourth movement would be God has no accidents. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's sovereign, and he's smart, and he knows what he's doing, even though sometimes in the middle of the story, and I kind of want to interject the idea of a story, that you can't stop a story in chapter 3, that sometimes we have to hang in there with God for a long time. But if we'll trust him with writing our story, we will see that he's a really good author. And so that all moves me to my final kind of movement, is that Moses became a person of faith because his parents were people of faith. And that as parents we want to model what we want to see happen in our kids. And Moses did that for Moses's parents did that for him, and they were willing to fear God instead of fear an earthly king. And they put their faith in action for their son, and God got involved. So basically that's kind of the five movements I have right now in the story of Moses. Thoughts, comments?
All right.
It's great. I think maybe we should let's let whoever's next go, and then we'll kind of I'm just kind of taking some mental notes here. I'm sure you guys are too, but I love it, Dave. It sounds awesome.
Okay.
Especially that first point.
I stole that from a really sharp guy.
Yeah, and so that's really good. And so if there's 5 points, that means I'm just thinking there are some overlaps with some themes that are going to come up, but
well, I kind of wanted
points, it's not like you're only going to have so long on any one point, right?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to fit into Alpine, so I thought I need to do one at least that's a 5-pointer.
Nice. Nice. That's good.
Yeah, that's it. That's all you got is just those 5 simple points.
That's good.
You're only covering a few chapters? What? Gosh, you're so weak.
Okay, well, Ross, you're week 2, so you want to...
Yeah,
If that left off where you were planning on it to leave off, then...
Yeah, that's great. No, I've actually got a 6-pointer. So
Whoa.
I'm gonna one up you one, Dave.
I have to. Can we pause this so I can go write some more points real quick?
That's right. You're gonna need at least 3 or 4 more points, probably. And I'll explain. You'll see what I mean as I go. So the big idea is that when our attitude is either I can do it or I can't do it, we put the focus on ourselves instead of relying on God. And so we tend to adopt one of those 2 attitudes in life. Either I'm fantastic or I'm a failure. So that's the background of the story. So I was going to tell the story of chapter 3, or chapter 2 rather. Moses in his early attempt to sort of act as a deliverer, he kills the Egyptian, and then he gets exiled out to the middle of nowhere. That's a long setup. It's really not that long, but it's a lot to hang out there without a title or anything, without a heading. So I'm going to just make that point 1 and make it the overarching point. So I'm going to say, learn to rely on God, not on yourself. That's what will introduce the whole idea. From Moses' life, we see the two sides. We see his sort of self-sufficiency and his self-reliance. And then we also see his being humbled on the other side. So that sets it all up for chapter 3 and chapter 4, where I'm going to go into these specific details. So I've got it as point 1. It's sort of a setup, but it was kind of a long setup. So I thought it'd be a good idea to have something, on the screen while I'm saying all that. So I have just the most generic point is simply learn to rely on God, not on yourself. And then I will use a verse from Exodus 2 about him slaying the Egyptian. But then the meat of it is here, these 5 things these 5 objections, these 5 inadequacies. So the point is that he had to learn to rely on God in his weakness instead of in his strength and instead of in his own weakness. So number 1, learn to rely on God's presence. So I'm going to reflect and say young Moses might have said, I make it clear here that God comes back to Moses and says, now is the time for you to deliver the people from slavery. So that's an important point here. So in response to that, then Moses has these five objections. So I've get each one set up in terms of like this. Here's what young Moses might have said. Here's what older Moses said, and this is where I'll quote the verse. And here's what God said in response to that, and then an application. So young Moses might have said, I can do this, I'll take on Pharaoh, just give me a sword, But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I'll be with you. So older Moses says, I can't do this. God says, it doesn't matter if you can do it or not, I'll be with you. So he had to learn that he could do it only because God is with him and not in his own strength. And then there's a lot of ways that I could apply that. We all have challenges in life. It's easy to be discouraged and just defeated, and so I'll figure that out. So number 1, rely on God's presence. Number 2, Moses had to learn to rely on God's person. Where young Moses could say, look at me, look at who I am. God sent me whether you like it or not. But older Moses says, what if I go to them and they say, who sent you? And what'll I say? So God reveals who he is. And I am has sent you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Moses has to learn that he can do it, but only because of who God is. And then we have to learn to rely on God's power. That's where young Moses might have said, I am powerful. My mother's Pharaoh's daughter, and so forth. But Moses says, what if they don't believe me? How do I prove that it's really you? And God gives him these 3 signs. The staff, the leprous hand, and the water that turns to blood. And so Moses had to learn that they would believe him, but only because of God's power manifest in his life, and then figure out how to apply that to the challenges that people face in life. The fourth one is we need to learn to rely on God's provision. So Moses, it's interesting because in Stephen in Acts 7 says that young Moses was powerful in speech and action. You know, powerful in speech, but now Moses says to God, I can't talk, I'm not eloquent, I've never been eloquent. The Lord says, but, you know, I made your mouth and I'll give you help. And so Moses had to learn he could do something that he found difficult because God would provide what he needed. And then I'll apply that. And then the fifth one is learn to rely on God's perspective. So we already seen young Moses said, I'm going to do it, I'm the one, I'm going to start by killing this Egyptian. But older Moses says, Lord, just send somebody else. And God says, no, I've chosen to send you. That's my plan. That's how I see it. And so Moses had to learn that God simply knows best, and God's plan is always best. And so ultimately he went and did it because in the long run he became convinced of God's ability, that God is the answer. When he saw how great God is, he took the focus off himself. Instead of saying, I can or I can't, it becomes God can, and God can through me. And then it has to close, it has a great gospel application, because those are two responses people have to the offer of grace. It says, I don't need it, I'm worthy, or I'm not good enough, God could never forgive me. But learning to look beyond ourselves and just focus on God's provision in Jesus Christ. So that's kind of, that's what I got.
It's great. I love the young and old stuff.
That helps me to keep that tension. There's no other way to keep the tension between the two sides. Otherwise, it just becomes a only dealing with our weaknesses.
Well, good.
Which it could be if you just didn't want to deal with chapter 2 at all. You could really make it that.
Scott, can I, before we move on, can I ask Dave, is there anything overly redundant there? Because you know your outline better than we do.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, what I was thinking, Ross, too, is older, young, or arrogant, or inadequate.
Yeah, trying to find a good alliteration or some catchy way to capture those two poles.
Yeah, I like it though. I think, and then what God says is fantastic.
And that's the end point for the whole thing. Really, is how it resolves itself. Is here's what God says.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It'll go pretty quick. Those will be pretty quick though, because you'll have, which is fine. The pacing will have to be quick.
Right. I have to go back through and think about application, and go back through and think about how many verses to read and how to capture the text itself. But it will go quick.
Well, yeah, because you're probably going to have some opportunity for some fun personal illustrations of a young, petulant, arrogant, I can do this, sort of thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It definitely lends itself to that, I think.
Yeah, to some good stories. Yeah.
All right. Well, good, very good. So we'll continue on. I'm week 3. So in week 3, it's called "When Faith Hits a Brick Wall." Is the title, the working title I have, and so I'm focusing in on chapters 5, getting into chapter 7, and so the big idea, the big idea is a life of pursuing God will lead to disappointments. Like, that's going to be natural just because of life, but God is greater and can overwhelm our disappointments and frustrations. And it's good to listen to those first 2 sermons, because I think I'll be able to navigate a slightly different path than the first 2, even though these are some similar ideas. But I'm going to start off the message at this point, much like Ross did, kind of catching up on the story. And so maybe I don't really have that as a point, like named as a point. I'll probably have some text up there, but maybe I can kind of come up with a point. But basically, it's coming out of this idea that God has called Moses, and he's got Moses and Aaron together. And so in spite of all his objections, Moses and Aaron go and they go before the Israelites, And the Israelites hear from Moses and Aaron, and they see the miraculous signs from God, and they believe that now God's going to rescue them. So this is like a high water mark. Moses he's had his failure in the past, but now God's restored him. They've gone through their dialogue, and now things are looking good. And so this is kind of parallels high points, in our own pursuit of God. Whether it's starting to maybe starting to understand the message of the Bible, or getting connected to people at church, or most of all coming to faith in Christ, we have these moments where just things sort of click, or things seem to really be working in our relationship with God. But then what often happens is that real life gets in the way, and that's the idea that Moses hit a brick wall. And so what we see moving into chapter 5 is that a life of faith has many moments of failure, or many moments of disappointment. And I can wordsmith that. But basically, Moses goes up to Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron, and they say, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "No, who are you? Why would I do that? You're my slaves. I'm not going to let you go." And so not only does Pharaoh reject this God-given command, but Pharaoh decides that his slaves have become too lazy. And so he makes them get their own straw, and the work becomes just that much harder on the Israelites. And so not only is Pharaoh and the slave masters are upset with the Israelites, but then the Israelites turn on Moses because now their life is harder. And so everything has kind of fallen apart in just a few verses for Moses. And he has to learn this lesson of dealing with failure, hitting a brick wall. Now you see where that pun really comes into play there. But as people of faith, as Christians, pursuers of God, we are going to face failures. We're going to face disappointments. We're going to face moments, whether it's you come to faith in Christ and you're excited about your pursuit of God, and you want to, you share that with your family and they're not interested, or whatever it is. There's these moments where we feel like God was calling us to do something, or we stepped out in obedience, and things didn't just really turn out as we planned. And that's kind of the experience that Moses had. So this kind of negative trial of the Christian life. And from there, moving on to the idea is that it's normal to feel disappointment with God. It's normal to be disappointed. Moses really just kind of it says he went back to the Lord and protested before God. And he said, "God, why have you done all this stuff?" He blames God for his circumstances. He blames God for all the failure and the disappointment. And he really turns on God. And I think that illustrates a few things. It illustrates that it's normal to be disappointed with God. This is Moses, a tremendous man of faith, right? Mount Rushmore, Old Testament kind of guy. And yet he felt this way. And so when life gets hard, it's natural to want to turn on God. But even more than that, what's interesting is God doesn't smote Moses. He doesn't just send a lightning bolt from heaven. He listens to Moses, and it's okay to kind of admit your feelings to God. It's okay to admit your disappointments with God. You don't need to hold back. God can take our disappointments and our frustrations and our feelings of even anger. And I think I might tie that in with some Psalms. We talked about that last time, but some of the Psalms that really express kind of the deep emotional life that we have as Christians. And so Moses does all this, and Moses kind of looks like the picture of Moses isn't amazing at this point. But what's interesting in chapter 6 is God's response to Moses in the midst of his failures and his disappointments and his frustrations. And God's response to Moses, I think, is similar to how God would respond to us in our disappointments and failures. And basically, God's response to Moses is, "Trust me." And what God does is he claims his own name as sort of insurance that he's going to do what he promised. He says to Moses, "I am going to deliver my people. I'm going to overwhelm Pharaoh. I'm going to do all these things that I said that I was going to do." He echoes that language from chapter 2 when he says, "I've heard the cries of my people, and I'm going to keep my covenant with them." And so all of this is sort of anchored but it's all anchored in God's character. And so the reason why we can have confidence in the midst of our disappointments is because of God, again, who he is, what he says about himself. He is the great I am, and he reaffirms that. And so ultimately our confidence, we certainly should learn, get to the point where we obey God and follow him and trust him, even when it gets hard. But ultimately our hope is is in God himself and in his own ability to carry out his promises. And so as the story turns, even though sort of from a human perspective things don't look very good, Israel still isn't backing Moses, Pharaoh still refuses to let the people go, we see that God is beginning to work the miraculous signs that are going to lead to the plagues, and God is holding up his end of the bargain. And so even though faith hits a brick wall, that's not the end. God is going to continue his work in our lives. And so so that's where that message ends, week 3.
Ross, do you have any, does that dovetail well? Is there any too much overlap?
No, it doesn't overlap, but I think I don't think it's redundant. But I think, Scott, you could pick up on from week 2 how Moses had finally resolved that he was going to trust God. It was hard for him to trust God. He finally resolved that he was going to do it, and then boom! Now that gets the legs get knocked out from under him. So there's that context. Not just that it's hard, and but that he had really gotten to the place where God had convinced him, and now what? So that would be a tie into week 2.
Well, yeah, and my question related to that for you guys, Scott, when I hear that title, I'm thinking about living in victory, then you hit a brick wall. And I don't know, is that what you mean, Ross, by kind of that resolve to trust God? Sort of like maybe more of an inward victory, or like, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm thinking when faith hits a brick wall, I'm thinking of that mountaintop experience. Are you ending with that, Ross, or Scott? Are you setting that up at the beginning?
Well, where I was planning to end was eventually Moses got on his donkey and rode off to Egypt. That he decided to obey.
Okay.
He decided to rely on God, and so he went and did it.
Yes, and I pick up on that mountain. Yes, I definitely. That's what I don't have I didn't crystallize into a point. I just called it kind of catching up on the story.
Mm-hmm.
But I can crystallize that into a point, I suppose. And
no, it doesn't need to be. I think it could just be set up.
Well, yeah. Either way, but yeah. That's kind of the point. These mountaintop experiences. I wasn't going to use the victory language and stuff because that's more.
Yeah, it's kind of.
I think that's where you're going, Brian. Yeah. But
yeah.
Moses' mountaintop experience is really interesting since I've been pondering that this week. It's not like Moses is, I think, supercharged up. Mm-hmm. I think he's settled in that God is bigger and he can do it. But I don't see Moses coming home from Promise Keepers.
Right. Yeah, I take it more from not so much where you leave off, but when it goes into the next passage when Israel's like, "Oh yeah, great, Moses, here, you're the guy." Like that's the more
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Scott. I think the better, I think with Brian, disappointment is in context to how far you go down. So if you don't paint that well, that's just it's a grave disappointment. It's a great disappointment because Moses is really upset, and if you don't show the high, it's hard to show the low. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is the high is just kind of his mountaintop experience? Maybe you can call it that mountaintop experience, and this expectation he's going to get there, and everyone's going to be like, "Yeah, this is."
Well, and they were. I think maybe the high is that they were initially.
They were.
Yeah.
And that's,
sorry, maybe I'm not making that clear, but that's what I'm saying is kind of like that's the moment when it must have crystallized for him. Yeah.
And that's not so dependent on week 2 as it's just inherent in week 3.
I see. Okay. No, that's great.
And the only thing I was thinking, Scott, is this. I think Moses, it's a great picture. I really like what you said. You can bring your disappointments to God and you're going to be disappointed. But I think sometimes as teachers, without being disrespectful, like my kids can be really disappointed even in me. And it's not even actually healthy for them to move from disappointment to disrespect. And I think sometimes as pastors, we've almost said, go ahead and be mad at God. Go ahead and hate God. Mm-hmm. And we haven't taught them, no, that moves too far. Disappointment's one thing. Devastation's fair game. Crying out, hurt, angry. But disrespect that's not good for God or good for you.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's great.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Okay, so then my title, anything else, Scott?
Nope.
So my title is When God Keeps Delivering You, or something like that. I've already started
Is that the
working
title?
on.
Or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I felt like it needed a little bit of a longer title this time. So my excerpt, I'll just read the excerpt because I kind of was writing out the article, and I'll just kind of read through the points to you. The excerpt is: the story of Moses teaches us that God doesn't call us out of slavery for a brief glimpse of the promised land. He has the power to deliver us for good from any kind of bondage. So the summary article itself says the story of the Exodus is a powerful story of deliverance from slavery to a better life. Though it occurred in history over thousands of years ago, it still has powerful implications for people today who are looking for freedom from modern day bondage. So my sermon is very specifically like freedom from bondage. So I'm using the Moses story as touch points, jumping off points to say, oh, we can do that same thing today. So point number one, God has ultimate authority over every ruler. So I'm just going to touch on the plagues in chapters 7 through 11. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on them because I don't have time. It's a 12-point sermon. Just kidding. It's only 5. But I talk about how for generations the Israelites had been enslaved to the Egyptians, and so that dominance, that generational dominance, sort of led everyone to wrongly assume that the slaveholder had authority. But God, in His timing, showed He had authority with the plagues. So it's kind of like an inspirational call to that person who's struggling with an addiction or with some kind of bondage in his or her life, to say, wait, God has authority over this thing, right? And so the text I'm going to use is Exodus 12, where Moses just says, get out, or Pharaoh just says, get out of here. Like, please leave and bless us as you go. Kind of like he cried uncle. Pharaoh gave up. He realized that he wasn't as powerful as he thought. So again, the lesson for us today is that God has authority over any kind of ruler that enslaves us, whether it's an addiction or a toxic relationship or destructive thoughts or whatever. Maybe you guys can help with some of those things. I kind of want a short list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 type of addictions or types of bondage that we can be in. So maybe you guys can help with that. The second point, continuing on in the story, is that deliverance requires a roundabout way. And so it keys off of chapter 13, where it says that when Pharaoh finally did let them go, God didn't lead them straight. He didn't lead them on the straightest path. They took the roundabout way because he didn't want them to have to fight other enemies. He didn't think they were quite ready in their sort of fragile transitional place. So again, I'm thinking about when someone is leaving bondage, it's not good to go to the bar and hang out the bars. Like you need to respect the process and respect that deliverance takes a roundabout way. That you need to the whole boundary thing. You're vulnerable at that time, so don't put yourself into battles that you're not quite prepared for. Because it's still new and fresh. Point 3 is God won't abandon us. So that's just the whole thing where He provided a light by night and a pillar of fire by day. A cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And just that He's going to walk with you through it. He's not going to abandon you. The fourth point was about bondage. Bondage is going to still be pursuing you. Kind of that addiction comes back. So the Egyptian Pharaoh changes his mind, and then they go after him. And so just that whole thing that don't sort of let your guard down. that bondage is going to keep coming after you, and you need to stay on your toes, kind of a thing. And then the fifth point I haven't really formulated, but it's basic. It's kind of the whole thing of the promised land is out there. You can live in victory. It's a long journey, but you can do this. You can live in victory. You know, I haven't really formulated that point. So the sermon is very much a deliverance from bondage sermon. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if that departs too much from the rest of the series.
I like it. I think I like that it's different. I like that you tie in just that you know, you have to pursue Christ and stay close to Christ because temptation still is going to come after you, and bondage still would like to keep you in its jail. I think that's good for me and for everybody. So I liked it that it's practical that way.
Yeah. What kind of bondage do you think people deal? You know, I wrote down addiction, kind of in big terms. I wrote down toxic relationships and then toxic thoughts, or whatever, you know, trying to think of, are those different enough? So addiction, you know, people with a sexual addiction or a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction or whatever, porn addiction, I think addiction covers that. You know, relational bondage, not including marriage. I guess I might need to say that. Now, technically, marriage is bondage. If that's the word you want to use, you might need a marriage mentor. And then just kind of like the thought life, bondage to your thoughts, slavery to your negative thoughts, and that kind of stuff.
The one I was thinking of that, you know, I see the most is worry and fear.
Yeah.
Just worry and fear, honestly, for most people, just can ruin their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be that third one, right?
Yeah. Thought life.
Is there anything else that, thought life, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this is thought life, but just something that I've seen or counsel, I don't know, just been popping up. But we don't really address much in sermons, is even just bondage to sort of like the way people perceive you, or like sort of like a fear of man is how I would usually think of it, but just kind of like we're obsessed with how other people perceive us or think about us, so we do things kind of to please other people, but in a real unhealthy kind of way. So it's kind of like people pleasing, but not in a good way. Like
Yeah, that's exactly the thing I was thinking of, Scott, is this bondage to what people think. To either drive me to do things that I shouldn't do, or to keep me from doing things that I should.
I was thinking of Israel. If you looked at Israel's problem, it was constantly idols. It was putting, you know, man-made things ahead of God, other things ahead of God. It was a massive problem, which is ourselves too. It's very American. I mean, that's American. Take care of yourself, build your wealth, build your future, have a happy life. But we kind of are going to talk, you've talked a little about that in other series, but...
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that is a fourth one that really deserves to be in there. So bondage to addictions, toxic relationships, destructive thoughts like worry and fear, and then just bondage to stuff, materialism. I think that should make it apply to everyone in the room. Right? And maybe the relationships is that peer pressure one, especially for young people, bondage to what people want you to do, or bondage to wanting to be accepted by people.
That might be a simpler way to talk about it, because when you say toxic relationships, my mind goes to the very popular toxic relationships post on Pursue God, and which is great, but that kind of is talking, like, you're not gonna have time to get into what that sermon was really all about in terms of like boundaries and unhealthy people. You know what I mean? I'm assuming you're not gonna have a lot of time to dig into that.
No. Yep.
Yeah, you could just talk about bondage to relationships. Why do we let people control us, or people's opinions, etc., control us, enslave ourselves to other people?
Yeah, there's that really good book, When People Are Big, God Is Small.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're thinking, Scott? More that kind of, I'm more worried about what they think about me than God thinks about me, and
yeah, absolutely. I had that book in mind. Whenever I talk to people about that, I have that book in mind. I'm trying to see if I have it right here on the shelf. But
yeah, that's a really good book.
Yeah.
Okay, so overall, does everyone feel like this series is helpful and not overly redundant? We're not saying the same thing week after week, or we're not saying completely different things week after week?
No, I think it's good. I think there's some themes that we come back to, but I think that's good. It reinforces them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's coherent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's great. I think it's a great October. It's really, listening to all of you, I think it's a life issues series. I think that's the category it fits best in our library. Do you guys, even, I was thinking each one of our series does, I think. You guys agree?
Yeah, I kind of think of every sermon series just about if it doesn't get down to life issues, then
yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But like our current Roman series is definitely a Bible study series, even though it certainly relates to life issues. Like I couldn't see my neighbor being like, "Cool, yeah, that sounds really good. Let's do Romans chapters 5 through 16."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of the exception.
Yeah.
I think this one also, it interacts a lot with who God is, because God demonstrates himself in different ways with Moses and with the Israelites. So there is that kind of theological identification of who God is also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's a savior. He can free you from bondage. He won't take your inadequacies and your pride. He's bigger than those things.
Yeah, so what's the series title and tagline?
Well, the last thing we left with was the God of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're just going to leave it at that. I haven't thought of a tagline.
It's an exciting part of the video.
For those of you watching online.
If you're watching this in the year 2017, please send us your title ideas.
Well, no, that's a good point. I think if there are people watching this before it's officially in stone, you can put it in the comments below on the community site.
Yeah, there you go.
But we were thinking God of Moses, so that we're really emphasizing this really isn't about Moses isn't the main character of the story. God's the main character of Moses' story. And so, can we emphasize that every week? I know in my slavery one I can. It's not about Moses or you. At the end of the day, it's about God and his ability to deliver you from that thing that enslaves you.
Yeah, pretty confident everybody. Ross and I terminate in that, and then
Yeah, I feel real good about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, God of Moses, and then subtitle is God is the main character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I think this video is hitting kind of our targeted time limit, right?
Yeah. So where Scott, this will be.
So yeah, so if you go to our leaders site on Google Plus, which if you're not familiar with that, you can find at pursuegod.org and go to our leaders page, and if you look in the sermon link section, you'll see the Moses series, and you'll have our notes, our current notes, and then as every lesson is complete or is close to completion, you'll see the post for every lesson in the series. So, and please let us know if you have any comments or thoughts, or put your sermon notes there if you're preaching this.
Yeah, and we'll put our notes, any other notes or anything else we have to share, we'll put that in the comments at that community page at Google+.
All right.
Okay. Sounds good. God of Moses. Ready?
Sounds
Let's
good.
rock and roll on it.